Grant us thy truth to make us free, and kindling hearts that burn for thee, till all thy living altars claim one holy light, one heavenly flame. Amen. From Sirach, today we hear, if you choose, you can keep the commandments. To act faithfully is something you can choose. And then we hear from Jesus. You've heard it said, but I say unto you. So two texts that the lectionary, the schedule of readings that we follow across Sunday to Sunday, have put into conversation with one another. The choice to keep commandments, and you've heard it said, but I say unto you. I'd like to spend some time with each of them and wonder how they might inform one another and what they might have to tell to us on this day. So it seems to me that commandments are something that kind of have a low stock at the moment. Ideas like obedience or fidelity, concepts like that do not have the popularity rating that they had at one time. We think of these things as maybe being antithetical to freedom, to being obedient is something that someone who is shackled does, someone who is constrained does. To be truly free is to not be obedient. It is to keep your options open, to do what you want with your life, to do things that are meaningful and joyous to you. And I suppose there's something to that. But I want to suggest that the obedience that we're hearing about in Sirach, the obedience that we might choose, is something different than obedience as unwelcome limitation. The element of choice is something that fundamentally changes it. A chosen obedience being different than an imposed upon one. So a lot of obedience in our culture is imposed. Most of the laws that we encounter are imposed by a police officer or by the IRS or by a border guard, I suppose. If you do not obey these laws or commandments, we're going to put you in jail, we're going to fine you, you're going to be publicly shamed, perhaps even all three. That's a different thing than a chosen commandment. What Sirach sure seems to be suggesting is that there are commandments, the commandments of God are enforced not by punishment. We're not going to be put in jail by God or sent to hell by God if we don't obey them, but rather they are enforced by our own hearts, by our own choice. Maybe that's an odd idea, or maybe it's an intuitive one. I'm not really sure, because it seems to me, if we start thinking about our own experience, that most of us have had the experience of freely choosing limitation, freely choosing constraint, freely choosing obedience, and discovering that we were most free within the constraints. That's not really a word, is it? Constraints. Thank you. It really took me a sec. Do you know on your computer sometimes that spinning beach ball shows up? That was in my field of vision for a second there. I was like, what word is this? I have no idea what I'm trying to say right now. I think many of us have had the experience of like within constraints finding we're most free. For some folks, that would be within a marriage. For other folks, that would be within parenthood, but it might as well be might also be within a deep friendship or a job in which you find deep meaning. There is this limitation that comes with saying yes to all of these callings, and we are most free having said yes to them. To sign up for parenthood, many of you will know this, is to take on a lot of limitations. You can't just do whatever you want, whenever you want. And a lot of times it doesn't feel like freedom at all. There's a time at 3 in the morning with a barfy baby where this feels not the least bit like freedom. And most parents, I want to suggest, when looking, sort of examining parenthood writ large, say, oh, this is actually very satisfying work. This is among the most important work that I have ever done, not in spite of it being limiting, not in spite of its constraints, but actually somehow because of them. This duty that I took on to another person is leaving me joyous and free. It is leaving me most completely myself. David Brooks has a beautiful and immensely sad article in New York Times this week about a friend who got into an immense depression and eventually died of suicide. And Brooks talks about accompanying his friend during this during the time of his depression, and the duty that he had to his friend, that real friendship comes with that obligation, freely chosen obligation, and that who would have it different if you have a relationship that you can sever as soon as things get difficult or hard? That doesn't really feel like a friendship at all. That doesn't feel like something holy at all. That is fleeting and false in many ways. There's times when Phoebe and the children are out of town, and I'm briefly a bachelor again, and I have this moment where I'm by myself in the house and say, like, oh, this is wonderful. My entire life is beer and horror movies for the next several days, and it's sort of awesome for a few hours. And then after not that long, I say, actually, I want my family back. That this superficial freedom is, I actually would prefer the deeper freedom that comes of the constraints that I have said yes to. I think many of us have seen people who never accepted any meaningful constraints in their lives, never really said yes to anything in particular. And I think, I mean, up until his death a few years ago, maybe the preeminent American example of that was Hugh Hefner, a guy who throughout his life spent his days wearing pajamas, surrounded by girlfriends, right? And I guess, in some respects, he was living the dream, wasn't he? Like, what could be better than the freedom of Hugh Hefner's life? Except I think most of us looked at that man and said, he's pathetic. This is a pathetic figure, an immensely lonely figure. I mean, I can't see into his heart. Maybe he was genuinely joyous, but he certainly didn't appear to be. He appeared in continually staying away from obligation, continually staying away from commandment. He appeared to have left himself like really isolated and unhappy. What if the commandments of God are like that? That when we choose them, not because God makes us and sends lightning bolts if we don't, but when we choose them, we become most free. When we say yes to serving neighbor, when we answer, yes, indeed, I am my brother's keeper, we become most free. What if that is the case? And what if God knows, if God is offering to us something that will leave us liberated and joyous? I've shared with you before my friend Douglas, who said of the commandment, you shall not kill, that the reason you ought not to murder people is, yes, it's bad to make people dead, but there's another reason, and that is if you kill people, that makes you into a murderer. And that's actually a terrible thing to be. We are most free when we voluntarily say yes to God's commandments. So having said yes, how shall we live? Having voluntarily said yes to God's commandments, as we do in the baptismal covenant, as we do in baptism itself, as we do in a marriage. All of these rites start with asking consent, don't they? Having said yes to God's commandments, how shall we live? Well, here comes Jesus. You've heard it said, but I say to you. So there is this argument that Jesus is inviting us into. If you do not have a resource like this one, this is an annotated Bible. I would commend one to you. You could find one at Broadway Books or at Powell's or at any number of bookstores, I imagine. And what sets apart an annotated Bible from a plain old Bible is it's copiously footnoted. I know there's people in this room who are fond of footnotes. And so you'll read through a passage like the one we hear from Matthew today, and what a lot of the footnotes tell you is what the text is drawing on, in this case, what Jesus is drawing on as he speaks. You've heard it said, and it turns out where you've heard it said is in Exodus, is in Deuteronomy, is in the book of Numbers. Jesus and the Gospels more broadly and Paul are in constant conversation with what for them was the Bible in its entirety. With what we call the Old Testament. They were constantly engaging in what scholars call intertextuality. That's a $3 word for a dialogue, argument, what rappers would call sampling, right? So they're constantly drawing on the old text, building on it, arguing with it, reshaping it, reinterpreting it. In this case, we hear Jesus taking the old text and wrestling with it, sort of like Jacob with the angel in the night. You've heard it said, but I say unto you. And what I want to suggest is that Jesus is doing this argument not as an eye-rolling exercise, not from a place of cynicism, not from a place of flippancy, but from a place of reverence. He reveres the text enough to argue with it. I had a philosopher friend who introduced a talk by saying, I consider it a evidence of respect when you argue with me. And I think Jesus is doing something similar. He respects the scribes and Pharisees. He respects the tradition enough to wrestle with it and say, yeah, you've heard these things, and there's lots that they get right. But I say this to you. We figured out some other stuff. God is still at work in United Church of Christ tradition. Is it their motto or aphorism is God is still speaking. So as we encounter the text, we say yes to it, and we have an and that we add to it, and we've discovered something else. The word of the Lord is absolutely what's in Scripture, and it's what's happening in our hearts and minds as we listen and respond. So, argument as reverence, I want to suggest, or argument as fidelity, I want to suggest is something that we know from some of the commandments, some of the obligations that we've voluntarily said yes to. If you deeply love another person, sometimes you love them enough to have an argument with them, to say, I think you are mistaken about this thing, or I wish you would behave differently, or I don't know what, I have some need that is not being met in this moment. That is not a relationship severing thing, but actually that is a relationship deepening thing to do. I'm partway through reading Daphne Demarneff, and I've never said her name out loud before. Do you know how you read things? I don't know if you had that experience as a kid of like reading a word, and then you say it out loud and you realize no one pronounces approximately that way or whatever the word is. I've never said Daphne Demarneff's name out loud, so I'm not totally positive that's how it's pronounced, but I'm going to go for it. She writes a book on marriage called The Rough Patch, and one of the things Demarneff says is that one of the deadly things that happens in relationship is not when the couple argues, but when a member of the couple says, "Well, that's just how he is. There's nothing to be done about it." That's an insidious moment in a marriage, in a friendship, in a workplace, in a church. When we just tell these stories, she doesn't listen. He thinks he knows everything. These are enemies of relationship, of reconciliation, of mutual understanding, enemies of the sort of wrestling that Jesus is inviting us to engage in. What if in the wrestling, our relationship will get deeper and more holy? I think I've told you before about going to the Holy Land. Grace did a pilgrimage a few years ago, and one of the most memorable moments was not a planned one on the trip. We got to the Western Wall, the part of the ancient temple that still stands after most of the temple was demolished by the Romans, and there was a rabbi there who was yelling at the wall, who was yelling accusation at the wall and threw it to God. Now, I don't speak Hebrew. I don't know what he was saying, but I know enough about body language of tone of voice to say this is someone who was on a emotional bender, who was saying to God, what is wrong with you? God, why are you not acting? Why are you falling down on the job? Now, my hunch, being a rabbi, these were not words spoken from flippancy. They were not words spoken from rejection of God. This was not some sort of, Dan and I were talking between the services about some sort of Richard Dawkins smarty pants atheism. Not at all. This is someone who loved God so much that he was willing to argue with God and challenge God and push against God. And Jesus invites us to do that as well. When this reading comes up, you've heard it said, I say unto you, I'll often hear from folks who say, I hate this reading. I hate this reading. And in particular, I hate the part about divorce because I'm divorced, and Jesus says you mustn't be divorced, and I feel this shame about that. And I guess that's a way we could read this passage, is that Jesus is giving us an updated, inflexible commandment, an updated law that we must follow whether we like it or not. Here's what you do. You have to stay married under all circumstances. Maybe, but if we allow the possibility that what Jesus is doing is modeling wrestling with the text, then that's actually not the takeaway at all from this. Jesus is not saying stay in an abusive marriage no matter what. Stay in a miserable marriage no matter what. He is saying we've inherited these commandments, and we are invited to pray upon them and challenge them and build upon them. So in his case, what he is saying is, okay, so the old rules say there's a way you can exit from a marriage, but what I am observing as I walk around is that widows are left destitute. This is a time when, more than today, a marriage is an economic arrangement, as much or more than it's an arrangement of love. And as men in particular are exiting marriages, these women are left struggling and destitute. That's not okay. You can't do that. That's a very different thing than you need to stay in an abusive marriage, you need to stay in a miserable marriage. I think Jesus would invite us to say, yeah, you've heard it said. You've heard it said in Matthew, but I say unto you, God wants fullness of life for you. God wants abundance and joy for you. Sometimes a marriage has died, and it's okay to name that. That's congruent with keeping the commandments. So, from Sirach, choosing the commandments of God, and in so doing, maybe in these commandments being most free and most alive, and having chosen them, engaging in the holy work of wrestling. And maybe through this choice into freedom and through this wrestling, through this, you've heard it said, but I say to you, maybe we will find our way into a deeper kind of freedom, a deeper kind of joy, a deeper kind of service to neighbor. Maybe we'll find that we become most fully alive, and perhaps we bring the kingdom just a little bit nearer.